Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webcast. My name is Ivan Semenek. I'm the science reporter with the Globe and Mail, and I'm pleased to be your moderator today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the Globe and Mail headquarters is located on the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Métis Nation, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Today's webcast is on the space economy and what the commercial space age could mean for Canada. Our panel is representative of what's been happening in the space industry for the last 2 decades, but really especially for the last 2 to 5 years, which people in the industry know very well, but which hopefully will reach a broader audience today. We're beginning to see a shift to a broader private sector engagement in space. It's a very exciting time for the sector. Today's speakers represent an array of applications in the space economy, each carrying commercial opportunities. Before we get to that, let me just say that while we're not anticipating any technical issues today, we appreciate your patience should any arise. If you need technical help, please click the help desk icon at the bottom of your screen. During the last 10 minutes of the panel, we'll be answering audience questions. If you have any questions for our panelists, please type them in the virtual Q&A box. Now, on behalf of the Globe and Mail, I'd like to recognize Maritime Launch Services for supporting today's event. Now, as your moderator, I'd also like to point out that Maritime Launch Services is also participating in today's event, and you'll see there's a very good reason for this in the context of what's been happening in the Canadian space sector recently and where our conversation could go today. So during today's event, I'll be drawing on that perspective as part of our broader look at the state of the industry with all of our panels. But in the interest of transparency, I just wanted to point out the dual role of Maritime Launch Services in today's event. I also want to point out my backdrop. As a journalist, I like to present my audience with the real thing, and so I don't want to advertise myself being in a fictitious environment. But I think in this case it's appropriate because what you see behind me, this graphic, is a representation of the Lunar Gateway, a future space station that will be in orbit around the moon, and a key component of that station will be the Canadarm3. You can see it kind of reaching around behind me. Which is being constructed by MDA, another Canadian company. Now that kind of represents a view of commercial space that we've come to know well. Where countries decide, or national space programs decide to undertake a big venture, and they may contract their national companies to contract companies to create these kind of cutting edge new technologies like the Canadarm, which has been so important for over the course of Canada's involvement in space. And sometimes in return, then we have there are other kinds of involvement that go with that. A Canadian astronaut will go around the moon sometime in the next couple of years as part of that involvement. But I think what we're going to talk about today is this growing expansion of the commercial side of the space sector, not just to kind of be filling out these contracts as part of a national program, but really fully developing the commercial opportunities of space, and especially with a focus today on where those opportunities might lie for Canadian companies, even companies that aren't necessarily seeing themselves as part of the space sector. So I think all of those could be an important part of our conversation. So let me now introduce our panelists. And joining me today, we have Stephen Mateer. He's the president and CEO of Maritime Launch Services. We also have Stéphane Germain, president of GHGSAT Inc., Christian Saleberger, president and CEO of Canadensis Aerospace, and finally, Azam Shagagi, who is a space activist, and I'll just mention she has broad interests in the sector and in public outreach. She's president of the Space Tourism Society of Canada, and also has a role as public affairs advisor for NASA's Deep Space Food Challenge. So as a starting point, I'm going to ask all of these panelists, as you can see, they have kind of diverse roles in the space community, to talk a little bit about their companies, their efforts, their projects, give you a sense of what their part of the space landscape is. So Steve Mateer, why don't we start with you? First of all, thanks all of you for joining us. Steve, let's start with you. Tell us a little bit about Maritime Launch Services and what your company is trying to achieve. Oh, you're on mute there, Stephen.
Never fails, right? Appreciate the opportunity to be here, Ivan. Thank you, and really glad to be here. So Maritime Launch Services, we've been at this for 6 years now, working to bring Canada's first and only commercial orbital launch facility into existence, with construction going for the last year or so. And it is really all about serving that massive market, the space economy that is really growing at such a huge rate these days. My colleagues here on this call, for example, have a huge need to get their satellites into orbit, and in an orbit that they care about, that helps them, provide the services that they have. And that location that we have in Nova Scotia is really perfect for serving that market opportunity for these satellite clients. And it's a bottleneck, frankly, with only government ranges doing launches today around the globe. Having a commercial launch site, and Canada's first, being able to serve that market is really important part, and really fundamentally, a part of why we're here. There are really, two major reasons, though. One is clearly being a part of the space economy. It's $464 billion last year by Euroconsult's estimates, and growing to $1 trillion a year. And 3/4 of that are the services that come out of them, such as what we're doing with greenhouse gas monitoring, et cetera. But those satellites on the ground are doing no one any good. They've got to get to space. So $10 billion of that 464 is launch. So in a big number perspective, there's this huge gap in the market and what we need to do to get these satellites into orbit. But then it's what these satellites are doing, and that's what I'm really happy about with this collaboration here today, is really talking about what this opportunity means for Canada from an economic perspective, but also what it means for us with relationship to the world we live in. The greenhouse gas, methane monitoring, the global climate change, and monitoring forest fires here recently, monitoring hurricanes, getting internet and Wi-Fi in place during weather events like that is really key for our future, and really an important part for me. It's about taking a small idea and turning it into a real opportunity for Canada.
That's great. And Stephen, if I could just ask one quick follow-up there, because essentially you're trying to offer access for any number of applications for companies that need to get to space for various reasons. Obviously, you found that there's a business case for doing this in Canada. Is there one particular sector, one particular application of space that you feel is really driving this now?
Oh, the global broadband is clearly an area of significant growth, recently, but it really is the tip of the iceberg. Internet of Things and remote control of vehicles, all of that stuff is going to require that throughput of satellites to space, to providing those services to our economy. You look at where the space shuttle program started, and the scientific benefits that came out of just doing that program to our everyday, that we don't even recognize as something that came out of that program that we're using on a day in and day out basis. So it's really about all the other stuff along with global broadband.
Got it. And of course, global broadband meaning, the ability to have a high bandwidth amount of data coming to your phone or your location wherever you are, coming from space. So that we're in an increasingly connected planet. So I think it's easy to see how that could be a driver. Stefan, I'd like to talk to you now about GHGSAT, because this brings us into the area not just of going into space, but also looking back at Earth. Tell us about your company, and you've certainly been quite busy the last couple of years. Can you catch us up on what GHGSAT is all about?
Sure, thanks, Ivan. So at GHGSAT, we use our own satellites to monitor greenhouse gas emissions from industrial facilities around the world. And so we can help oil and gas companies, power generation companies, landfill operators, anybody who's got an industrial source of greenhouse gas emissions, to better understand, control, and ultimately reduce their emissions. So our satellites are designed specifically to go down and look at individual oil wells individual landfills, and really understand what's going on right down at a resolution that these operators can actually go and find and fix emissions. So the whole business case was designed for that, and this is really a purely commercial venture designed around the ability to offer environmental services to industrial operators. Now, because we can do that for industrial operators, we can also do it for governments and for other third parties that are interested in the data and in the insights that our satellites provide. So we work, for example, with governments that want to understand where there are emissions that they weren't otherwise aware of, or that want to have a better handle on their total carbon footprint or greenhouse gas inventory. And so we work with Environment Canada, for example, in Canada, but we also work with the United States. And just a couple of weeks ago, we announced a large contract with the United Kingdom. So each of these governments is interested in how greenhouse gas data at a facility level can be used to reduce their own emissions in their own jurisdictions. So in general, that's what we do. We generate the data from our satellites, and then we transform that data by combining it with third-party sources of data using machine learning to really look for trends and patterns in all of that data, and then provide the insights that our customers need to manage and reduce their emissions. And that's a business today that is thriving. We are tripling our revenues this year for actually several times in a row now, several years in a row. And we're launching more satellites. We have 9 on orbit now. We're launching 3 more before the end of the year. And stay tuned for more announcements on that front as well.
Got it. I know it's a big, of course, you've had some big years with more satellites going up, and I think there's a big year coming up with, because if I understand correctly, you've up till now, you've been providing data on methane, which is an important greenhouse gas, but you're going to be expanding that repertoire.
That's right. Yeah. So far, we are focusing all our satellites on methane, but there are 2 primary greenhouse gases. One is actually the most important one in terms of total volume is carbon dioxide, and then the second one is methane. So you want to measure both of those if you can. We started with methane simply because over 50% of the emissions of methane worldwide are what's called fugitive. In other words, you don't know where or when those emissions are going to happen. And that means if you're a large industrial operator like an oil and gas company that has methane, which is natural gas, it's basically the same thing, and you have several stages of that upstream, midstream, and downstream, and you have tens of thousands, in some cases even millions of pieces of equipment that can leak. Satellites are ideal for helping you find your big leaks fast and fixing those in a prioritized way. So that's why we started with methane, but we can't ignore carbon dioxide. It is, by far the largest volume, and we're very much looking forward to having our first carbon dioxide satellite up later this year.
Great. Christian Salenberger, I want to talk to you now. Canadensis is a company that makes space hardware for all kinds of applications. Why don't you give us a sense of the breadth of those applications that you're building in Ontario?
Sure, Ivan. Thank you. So, I was just reflecting that, listening to Stephen and Stefan describe things. I like to characterize the space world into 3 broad areas of things we do in space. There's telecom satellites, and I think they're a big part of the customer base of Stephen's organization, Maritime Launch Systems. And then there's Earth observation, which is where conservation GHGSAT's one of the leading companies. And then the third area is space exploration, which is sending missions out to the moon, Mars, and beyond, human space flight, all of that area that sort of lump into the third part of space-based exploration. So Canadensis Aerospace is very much working in that space exploration sector. We've received a lot of attention recently because we've been selected to do Canada's first lunar rover. So we'll be building a rover that's part of the broader Artemis activities of human reinvestigation of the moon. We'll be looking for water on the moon on our mission in the permanently shadowed craters of the South Pole. We also, as a company, are responsible for the activities related to food production and greenhouses on the moon to provide fresh vegetables to the astronauts when they're on their missions to the moon. We've also, we do a lot of science instruments. We had some cameras on a Japanese mission we released some pictures publicly of some great shots of looking back at the Earth when we were heading to the moon, and then at the moon when we arrived. We 2 weeks ago delivered a multispectral microscope to NASA for a NASA mission called Vertex to do some investigations on the moon. And so this is sort of the type of business we do. In the next 2 years, we have 25 different pieces of hardware we're building that'll be operating on the lunar surface with a number of different missions. And I should add, perhaps just to round out the context, about 80% of our business is commercial. Only about 20% is for governments. Most of that for the Canadian government, but we do work also, as I mentioned, for NASA, for the European Space Agency, for the Japanese. And we also do onboard computers and high power distribution systems for spacecraft, sort of on the commercial side as well. And then a few terrestrial spin-offs from that space technology, which maybe we'll get into a little bit later.
Sure, absolutely. And one thing I want to ask you, this is very exciting, thinking about, sort of being on the moon and creating, I think what we might have, if we were having this conversation 10 years ago, there might have been a more familiar kind of refrain about how, space agencies like NASA, the Canadian Space Agency, have a lot of experience in low Earth orbit, and companies have come along in telecommunications, Earth observation, so on. And the idea was, the low Earth orbit should, increasingly be the domain of the private sector, so that the space exploration can continue further. But I think it has been a surprise in recent years to just see how, those companies are following right along, and that there are a lot of commercial development looking beyond just orbiting around the Earth and looking further. I'm wondering, Christian, if you're surprised, and can you give us a sense of how fast it's changing, that there really are commercial opportunities on the moon or beyond?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail right on the head with that summary there, Ivan. We're really in a transformative time right now in that space exploration area. It's we're seeing private companies do things, as you said, not just telecom, Earth observation, but really in the exploration area. We have customers that are interested in doing mining on the moon, and we're supporting them with the hardware to be able to do that. We see the announcements that Elon Musk is making privately to send missions to Mars and beyond. This is the discussion that's happening internationally now, and I think Canada is well placed to play a key role in that. And as I mentioned, our business, and we're very focused on space exploration. 80% of our revenues are commercial revenues, not government missions.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, why don't we pick it up from there and go to Azam? Azam, of course, you have many interests here and you've worn many hats in the space sector. You're president of the Canadian Space Tourist Society. I'm wondering, maybe you could give us a snapshot of what that society is all about, and where you would, how you would describe the current state of interest in space tourism.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. Obviously, people always ask why space, as we have a lot of problems on Earth to solve. So that's why I have participated in many of the space advocacy organizations, as I studied at International Space University and NASA Ames. So this is part of our mission as an entrepreneurs in the space sector, to provide space advocacy and space education, why space is important. Because right now, if it wasn't for space, I wouldn't be connected to this panel and I wouldn't be able to talk to you. And so there's like so many different applications that it would take hours and hours of discussion, of course. But what Space Tourism Society of Canada is actually providing is to make space kind of like very interesting topic, and provide information to the public that space could be available for everybody eventually. and providing with a lot of different, for example, school talks or presentations, interviews, joining partnerships, organizations, and at the same time, we've been participated as part of the Canadian alumni International Space University. We were part of the Space Review report of Canada, a lot of different other initiatives in the Congress, for example, regarding space policy, or creating partnerships with different organizations. If there has been some opportunity to mentor few projects or few public projects, like, for example, NASA has initiated the food challenge, the deep space food challenge, that is actually providing a lot of space engagement for the next generations. And at the same time, putting this challenge out there that if we go to space, how can we solve our food challenges and why space is important. So a lot of different things in the sector that we've been actually trying to do. I don't think that I can explain in such a short time, but also space provides a lot of opportunity for us for space, for global security. And as we see right now, with the cybersecurities that is actually happening in the space, obviously with the Russian war right now, every day there's been an outage somewhere in the world, mostly in the US. I don't know about Canada. So these are also the challenges that might actually space could solve. And also we are dealing with agriculture, with environment. So there's a lot of opportunity that space can actually be beneficial.
Got it. And I wonder if you would say, over the time that you've been involved in the sector, how do you, I mean, we're seeing how the commercial sector is changing. How do you think public perception is changing, or is it changing? I mean, kind of how people are imagining space.
Unfortunately, I don't see public change is changing their opinions, especially in Canada, because there is not a lot of media involved. As for example, there's so many challenges being initiated by NASA, and there's so many funds available to individuals that they can actually create. Like there's like STEM, science, technology, engineering, math fund that people could apply and use that towards educating, for example, school kids. But we don't have such a funds in Canada, and there's not a lot of also information about why space is important today, especially for the Canadian sector. Even though most of the like I went to International Space University, most of the alumni from Canada now they have actually immigrated to US. Unfortunately, they have started their own company. Each of my classmates they had now they have a payload company, for example, or a satellite company. And they couldn't actually operate in Canada, unfortunately. There's a lack of policy, there's lack of funding, there's lack of a lot of understanding, and so we need, for example, Artemis is going to be playing a great role, and also a spaceport would create another role.
Got it.
Well, Ivan, can I make a comment there?
Sure.
As alumnus of the International Space University, I started a company in Canada and it's working pretty good. And so I, with all respect, disagree that Canada is necessarily a bad place to start a space company. We have a lot of interesting support mechanisms for new companies in Canada, such as the SHRED program, for example. If you're in space, you're doing fundamental research typically, and so Canada's a pretty good place, I think, to address space activities. The market is international, 100%.
Yeah. I'm saying it's not bad. I'm saying there's so many obstacles versus US. These obstacles are being understandable, and there's so much funding opportunity. There's so many VCs that can fund your project. You wouldn't have to bootstrap your company. But in Canada, you have to start from the beginning. You either lose your all savings or you would succeed. But how many years you have to do that? So I've dealt with a lot of entrepreneurs in the sector, and unfortunately, none of them have actually built their company since I've been in contact with them. And they have, I know someone that actually was so much interested in space, studied astronomy, and is actually working at Scotiabank as a data analyst. this is the sector that we're talking about. But of course, Christian, you've been one of the founders of ISU. I know you, but there's also a lot of different this generation is facing. So this is not as probably was in your era.
Well,
We'll have to choose to disagree on the point of whether Canada's a good place to start a space company. We certainly looked at the US before we founded Canadensis Aerospace and chose Canada. I think some of the other panelists probably would agree that Canada is a pretty good place. But one thing we can agree upon, the International Space University is a good background for space activities. And Ivan, I know some sector of the audience here will be younger people starting out a career, and the International Space University, ISU, is certainly a good place to get a full perspective of space activities. And saying that with some bias because I'm currently serving as a chairman of the board of the International Space University, but do check that out if you're interested in a career in space.
Got it. Thank you for pointing that out, and actually thanks both of you for those perspectives. I think they're both important perspectives to hear, and of course, as the limitations of venture capital are probably not unique to this panel. I would say, based on we could just thinking about quantum computing or other emerging areas, those limitations also arise. So actually, that leads me to I'd like to go around the table one more time before we kind of go off into kind of more individualized questions for you. I've got one more question for everybody, which is really to place yourself in the context of the global landscape, and maybe we can get at this issue, where things work well in Canada, maybe where they work not so well, or where Canada has limitations or challenges, or how Canada can leverage, potentially unique assets that maybe put us ahead in some ways. I think maybe Steve Matera is a good place to start with this, because Steve, you came to Canada from the US, so obviously you saw something here to help your company get rolling. Can you give us a sense of what drew you here, but also how it fits in with global competition?
Yeah, we did a study back in 2016 looking at a dozen different locations in North America that were looking for that place to be able to put satellites into orbit in places that people want them. And the adage location, location, location landed. It really did, because in Nova Scotia, we can do polar sun-synchronous orbit inclinations to 45 degrees off the coast of Africa all the way down to South America in that large swath. And that's where most of the satellites today are going up. I would echo Azam's feelings about hard to get going with our project, and it has taken some time to get that ball rolling, but also echo Christian. I think there's a great deal of support for getting us there. We are fully licensed now. We've got all the regulations completed. We've got the government of Canada announcing their support for regulatory launch, and it is really about tapping into what that market opportunity is. I spoke to the space economy, and once we're up and running, the 12 launches a year just with one vehicle, a medium class launcher that we're planning, will bring an EBITDA of $454 million per year. And then underneath that is that space economy impact to Canada, to Nova Scotia, of $300 million per year by us doing this activity. And that's enabling all of my colleagues here to do things in space that are helping them as well. And with that, while we're only looking to employ 300 or so people on this thing, there are going to be several thousand people that benefit from this space economy component that Maritime Launch is bringing to Nova Scotia, right, and to the surrounding area here. So this waterfall effect, I think, is really tremendous. And the other part to me that is the most important for me from my early days working on the space shuttle program, I've been doing this 30 plus years, half of it with NASA, working on the space shuttle program, is working with kids and enlivening them to be a part of looking up and seeing what they can do and what they can be a part of. We've got a co-op student from a high school. We've got a university suborbital launch coming next month by York University. That helps us exercise all of our ConOps. We've got a first orbital launch next year planned to also bring all those ConOps to fruition for deploying satellites into orbit, and then bringing that medium class launcher to bear after that. But the whole idea of this, I have to tell you, the night before last, I had the extreme pleasure and opportunity to be with former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney and our current Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in Antigonish at an economic forum, and hearing them talk about the arc of history and what the future looks like, and getting into the day-to-day squabbles means nothing. It's the big stuff that matters. This is such an opportunity for Canada to be really a part of the new commercial space economy. We've got great capabilities with the CSA, great capabilities with MDA, Telesat, GHGSAT, and all these other companies, Kepler, et cetera, that are doing some amazing things already. So now let's complement the whole picture and add space launch, because that's the bottleneck. That's where people are having the most trouble right now, is getting their satellites into orbit. We're sending checks to SpaceX, to Elon Musk at 65 million a pop or whatever it is for a full launcher, and we can keep that in Canada. We can keep our students in Canada instead of shipping them off to the US and other places to be a part of the space economy elsewhere. So to me, it's this real opportunity in this arc of history, and looking forward to look back and see where we're going as a country. It's our time. We've got the location, we've got the talent, we've got the capabilities, and we do have the investment interest in place, and it's just ours for the taking.
Wow, and Steve, I think it's fair to say also that the existence of maritime launch services is actually kind of altering the regulatory environment. We haven't got this far before where there's been a company so close to launching privately, and the federal government's had to respond by adjusting regulations and so on moving in that direction to make that possible. So I guess we're already even in that, by that measure alone, kind of in a world that's a little different here in Canada than it was a couple of years ago, where there are some possibilities that maybe weren't possible before. And so, Stefan, let's talk to you now, because GHGSAT also was kind of an early mover into this space, but certainly there's a lot of interest in monitoring, with climate change becoming an increasingly urgent issue, and the need for monitoring and measuring to sort of help reinforce targets and to, I guess, make negotiations internationally more realistic or more quantitative. There's a need for these data. You were able to get in early. How do you keep that? What do you see happening elsewhere in the world?
Well, for first, I've got to go back to the earlier discussion about whether Canada's a good place to start a business. I got to get my 2 cents in here too. And obviously, I think that Canada is a great place to start a business in space.
Oh, I think we lost your audio there. Hang on.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we got you.
We're back. Okay. So Canada's
Stefan,
a fantastic.
I think Ivan disagreed with you and hit the mute button on you.
That's right. All right. So Canada is a fantastic place to do R&D. All right, let's start there. We have really good financing mechanisms for taking ideas through to initial demonstrations and prototypes. And then this is where Azam's point gets very important, which is that we have limited resources to scale businesses beyond the initial startup phase. All right, and that's where you definitely have to look to the international market for financing, but that doesn't it doesn't necessitate the company leaving Canada. Quite the opposite, because I think we have a highly trained workforce. We have a really strong technology base with several niches that we can build on. Like in our case, we build on optics in particular to really differentiate ourselves in the world scene. So no country has a perfect mix of all these things, other than maybe the United States, which really stands out on its own as an ecosystem of space, of the space economy. But anyway, I just wanted to get that point in. Now let me answer your question. for GHGSAT, we really truly offer a global service. We operate in a global environment just by nature of what we do. I mean, we're addressing climate change, and climate change is by nature global. There's nothing regional about climate change. We are all affected by methane emissions in Central Asia. We're all affected by carbon dioxide emissions in the United States. So whether you like it or not, we all have to deal with this issue together. So it's amazing actually to see the trend in climate monitoring satellites that look back at the Earth, and how that started from a handful of satellites 10 years ago to now, amazingly, we actually operate, I believe, the largest fleet of climate monitoring satellites in the world as GHGSAT, and we want to maintain that lead, but there's a growing number of satellites that are being launched that have capabilities to monitor not just greenhouse gases, but looking at floods, looking at hurricanes, looking at other climate factors that we all need to pay attention to as unfortunately the planet suffers from more and more effects of climate change. So where we manage to keep our edge is, first of all, as a purely commercial company, we know we have to compete in the niches we've selected to compete in. And I actually welcome competition from new players because it forces us to stay sharp. It forces us to innovate. And again, Canada is a great place to do that innovation. It forces us to not only have the best sensors in the world and be 2 generations ahead of anybody else who's going to come up, but also to have some of the best machine learning and AI skills around in order to interpret that data and make it available to our customers. And then finally, to have the commercial capabilities to really explain and translate the really complex data that are generated from satellites to an actionable output, an actionable insight that customers need every day, fixing a pain point that a commercial operator of a landfill or a coal mine has to understand what their emissions are and where they're coming from so they can fix them. So we truly compete at a global scale. But I should also add, and I don't want to go on too long here, that we also put a lot of emphasis on collaboration. Again, because we are dealing with a global problem, some would say a global crisis. So we really do work very hard with international institutions, with space agencies that are putting up satellites that have capabilities that are complementary to what we do, so that we can actually optimize the performance of the whole network of satellites that are in orbit today. So a great example of that is we've been working with the European Space Agency now for about 5 years, using their satellites to help home in on where we should point our satellites to be most effective at finding large emissions around the world. And I know that others are planning on doing the same thing and emulating what we've done, which just means that we will have to then take the next step to, again, remain differentiated and remain competitive. So it's a really exciting, dynamic market that's growing very fast, unfortunately not for great reasons, because there's a huge need for these data. But we're very excited to be the global leader in what we do today with the largest constellation in the world of climate monitoring satellites. And we're really looking forward to keeping up that lead.
Got it. I'd like to go to Azam next, and then I'll come back to you, Christian, because Azam kind of opened up this conversation where there are some limitations in Canada, or at least maybe for people trying to move into the sector, who bring a skill set to the sector. They see opportunities elsewhere. Azam, I'm wondering what you see as how that could be remedied, or how that could shift a little bit. I mean, there are always, Canada is a relatively small country in terms of population, on especially in kind of these specialized or very technology dependent sectors. So what do you think could help shift the balance a little bit? And maybe this is already happening to some degree, so that it looks like there are more opportunities to develop talent, and then the commercial benefits that go with that talent here at home.
Of course, and I'm actually just trying to provide the challenges here, not to be negative about my country. But for example, CSA, actually, they cut the funding for scholarships for example, ISU a few years ago, and also a few other companies that are in the space sector, right? So this actually cut immediately the promotion of inspiring the next generations or engineers or people that always had a dream to go to space, right? And the government funding also doesn't cover anything in regards with providing STEM education. So all actually is remaining. For example, what we see in the US, now NASA is commercializing the LEO orbit, which will open a new sector in the system, or in the space economy that would actually activate companies that were private and in other sectors, and then they will find a niche, or they will find that their solution or their tech is providing a solution in this sector, right? So there's going to be a lot of innovation and this is how NASA has actually realized that they cannot be no longer a private only, kind of like very closed. And another problem that we have, there's a lot of VCs in the US, obviously they don't want to invest in Canadian-based companies just because of ITAR and a lot of regulatory restrictions in the US that would actually eliminate competition. And another great topic that everybody was talking about, the competition. There's a lack of competition in Canada, and unfortunately, Canada is a country that is very conservative in terms of competition. We've seen that in telecommunication sector, we've seen that in the banking system. So this is part of the Canadian culture. This is part of the foundation. Competition is limited, and so all we are trying to do is trying to actually create this kind of like culture, new culture, I would say 2.0 or something, that we need to have competition. We need to force the government in order to open the competition, cut the monopolies, oligopolies in the sector, right? For example, we see that there is a huge demand in the defense sector right now with what is happening in Ukraine, and Canadian government is announcing that they're providing funds. I'm working with a Canadian company in SAR technology, synthetic aperture radar, and it is taking a lot of time to actually get this funded to get it to, for example, Ukraine. So this is all we hear, and they're just very nice talks. At the same time, the bureaucracy level in Ottawa is really huge. You have to actually, if you want to be in the sector, I don't know about the gentlemen here that are in the on a panel, you have to actually hire lobbyists in Ottawa to do that things for you, because this sector is highly regulated and highly kind of like part of the elite. So this is, I'm part of the industry. I studied at International Space University. We call it ISU Mafia. You only actually, if you're in a network, you can do everything and a lot of things, right? So, and we know everything is connection based. So we're trying to expand that. We're trying to change the culture that this is not just kind of like an elite sector. This is not, going to space is not just, you have to be kind of like rich. If we are helping in the technology advancement, we will actually bring down the prices. And imagine if SpaceX was in Canada, they will never be able to launch one satellite or one, because there's like so much regulation involved, and God knows about the taxes and the climate change taxes and so forth. So this would be something that I think we need to solve, and that's why I'm working in the sector. I'm like with different organizations, with different policymakers, with different activists, just to solve this, and with like media, with the magazines, with the celebrities, just to solve, because there's no other way. Like we can sit and complain, but also execute. So I think that would be very healthy.
Okay, I want to pick up on one thing that you mentioned, which I think is a really important term that maybe some of the people who are listening may not be familiar with. You talked about the ITAR regulations, which is something that applies in the United States, where there's there are some restrictions in sharing technology or in collaboration, because there could be dual use, or because the technologies that enable kind of the commercial exploitation of space also could have a defense role, defense consequences. So there has been a challenge in the past for Canadian companies, for example, wanting to compete or work with the U.S. government, because they're sort of seen as outside that security wall. So I know, Christian, you said that, for your business, these government contracts are maybe only about 20%, but I do wonder how that plays into things when you're competing with companies in the US or elsewhere in the world, that there are also these barriers that might inhibit growth, especially if you sort of have a mixture of public and private clients.
So it's true that space is a somewhat unique sector, and there are these kind of restrictions that are imposed on government and commercial business both. The ITAR regulations apply broadly. Um, Things have been improving there. A lot of things that were on the ITAR list, space technologies now have been removed. So it's moving in the right direction, I believe, as far as ITAR is concerned. And it's important to be aware of those restrictions in the US because, as somebody mentioned just a few minutes ago, the US is such a dominant player in space. The US is larger than all the rest of the world put together in terms of its space activities. So whether you're located in the US or located in Canada or anywhere else in the world, you need to know how to interface with that large American market and suppliers and customers and all of that. But it's a manageable problem. But similar to ITAR, we have in Canada, we have a controlled goods program that's very similar. When we, for example, that camera we sent to the moon recently, imaging system, multi-camera imaging system. We had to get an export permit for that. It was going up on a Japanese spacecraft, integrated in Germany, launched by SpaceX in Florida. We need to demonstrate to the government that there was no national security risk with our hardware going to those places and going out to the moon. But those are logistical steps that can be easily overcome, I believe. I don't think it impedes business. But the I think a better way to look at the space market, the space world, it's really the national borders are not as distinct as they are in other sectors, I would say. It's very much an international business. We work with partners, subcontractors, customers all over the world, and I think most of the panelists here would agree with that. You need to be able to do that. In the area of space exploration, which we work in, there's a big interest now in the moon. We see that in Europe, in the US, in Asia, all over everybody's interest in the moon and human activities to the moon. The Artemis Accords that the US led on, I think there are over 20 nations now that are part of that want to contribute to returning humans to the moon. So very exciting times to be part of that. And by the way, very interesting to be located in Canada because of the kind of friendly relationship as a country we have with other parts of the world, not just with the U.S. Certainly, we have a very strong relationship with our friends across the border, the southern border. But Canada is a member of the European Space Agency. We heard Stefan talk about working for ESA. We just recently completed a study for the Europeans on how we could use one of our rovers with some science instruments to detect lava tubes on the moon. These caves below the surface, which are creating quite a stir in the scientific community. So great to be part of the European Space Agency's network by being located in Canada, and in other places there are bilateral partnerships. What's changing, I think, is that the public is becoming much more interested in space, or interested in real space. Now, there's always been interest in Star Trek, Star Wars, those kind of things, but now the real space activities are accessible, and people are galvanized by the opportunities, and with human missions and scientific missions and data coming back, it's and even the ways it changes life on Earth, like what GHGSAT is doing, improving our day-to-day lives. So we try to be part of that trend as well. We've got, for example, we have a large, small hockey rink sized indoor test facility for our rovers, like a big sandbox. We partnered with a company called Let's Talk Science, an educational company. They any grade school child across Canada, I think it's grades 5 to 8, can write in an essay on how they would plan a lunar mission, and the winners get chosen, and they win for their classroom the opportunity to do a real simulated lunar mission where they remotely drive one of our lunar rovers in the lunar landscape with their classroom, facilitated by the Let's Talk Science educational experts. So that appetite and interest for space is out there, and I think it's an onus on us in the space industry to share the excitement of what we're doing with the broader public.
I think it's interesting to see it's not, it's beyond just kind of the interest in that kind of general interest in space as a something that fuels the imagination, but also that could be a very concrete part of the economy as well. So it's kind of an interesting transition. We're kind of at the 10-minute mark. We just have 10 minutes left to go. So I want to turn to some audience questions, and I encourage people to send their questions, and we've already got some. We'll try to get to as many as we can, and at the very end, I'll go around the panel for a quick takeaway from everyone. But Steve, I'll start with you because there's a question about what's needed in terms of the regulatory environment. We've talked about it in Canada, like the environment, the regulations for allowing launches. But there is this idea, this additional, which I think is a good question, with more and more launches, more and more hardware going up in space. What kind of regulations are needed, or what kind of evolution in that international as well as national regulatory environment is needed to manage growth? We're kind of imagining many more things orbiting around Earth. How would you say what's needed there? Oh, did we lose? Oh, you're muted right now.
Of course. Big picture, Canada, international countries have been signatories to treaties dating back decades on the safe collaboration and use of space, and how we're all going to play in the sandbox of low Earth orbit and beyond together in harmony. So those have been in place for a long time. What has really changed now is with this commercial ramp up over the last 10 plus years, with commercial companies within these countries that have to fit underneath that umbrella of those architectures for collaborations in space. And so working through those pieces is continuing effort. We're putting a lot of satellites into orbit. How we're going to clean up after ourselves, how we're going to maintain those orbits, how we're going to remove dead satellites, all that stuff is on us to really enable right now. And that's moving forward. For me, locally, though, Canada has a framework and has always had a framework going back decades for regulations for launch and suborbital launch into orbit under the civil aviation regulations. And we're actually going to be doing our first launches based on those existing regulations. They're wanting to take what we learned together with them and fold those into a more revised, robust regulatory framework for the future. Yes, on what satellites and how they're regulated, and in broadcasting and payload reviews, et cetera, along that way. But for now, Minister Alghabra made the announcement on January 20th that we're embracing this new frontier, and we're going to take our role in the space economy, and we're going to launch rockets. We're not going to slow things down. We're stepped up to make this happen. And that was the part that I was really thrilled to have him talk about. But again, going back to the big picture, we all have a responsibility on what we're doing in space and helping to maintain that. Our first launch is working with NanoRacks. They've already signed on, and we're going to actually reuse our upper stage. We're going to repurpose old satellites and pull them out of orbit and replace them with one of our clients as well. So it's really all about working that future, how we care for the environment. And now that environment is just not the Earth and the air around us, it's now low Earth orbit.
Got it.
And Ivan, maybe I can just add to that if I can. So in low Earth orbit in particular, there's been a lot of we may be polluting our low Earth orbit environment with a lot of debris. And so there have been increasing calls for some sort of air traffic control or space traffic control that would manage all these different objects in certain orbits anyways, in low Earth orbit. But in the meantime, because that would be horrifically complex to put in place just because it involves every single nation on the planet, there are some guiding principles that are being put together. So for example, just last week, we released with the World Economic Forum some debris mitigation recommendations. So GHGSAT, along with about 30 other operators of satellite constellations, put out these recommendations that basically are common sense. The things that we should all do in low Earth orbit, principles that coordinating to make sure we don't have collisions and things like that. So there's It's a very important question. It's a very important thing to address. I just wanted to highlight that there is some progress in low Earth orbit management for now.
Got it.
If I can just add one quick,
sure, very quickly, as I'm
comment on that. Sure. Yes. So by commercializing the LEO actually orbits of the Earth by NASA, there's going to be obviously a lot of companies that are providing a solution for not deorbiting the satellites, like a gas station. So I think this is going to be a lot more sustainable solution. So this is part of the econ.
Got it. Excellent. Azam, I want to stay with you for one more minute. We've just got a few minutes left, but I'm getting a lot of questions that have to do with, what people can do to be best qualified for this industry. I'd like to actually put that to all of you, but Azam, let's start with you. For example, in the past, people might have an aerospace degree, also go to the International Space University, but we've heard, like artificial intelligence now being applied to space. There are other skills as well. What would you recommend for people who are earlier in their career trying to make choices about how to equip themselves with the skills that they could use to be in space, to be in the space economy?
Sure. I would actually say the only thing they require is passion. So I'm originally from Iran, and I always wanted to go to space. I always looked at the sky and the stars, and I was like, I don't belong here. I belong up there. So I worked so hard through my life. So I eventually got a scholarship to go to NASA and International Space University, well, hopefully station from Iran. So if I can do it from Iran, anybody can do it from US or Canada or anywhere in the world. And I would say just you have to be really passionate and you have to be really focused. And there's like so many opportunities. You can study engineering, you can study finance now, you can study science, because the sector is so broad. You can actually work in the field, but it depends what you want to do. If you're a lawyer, you could be a space lawyer. If you're a financier, you could actually help with the startups to get funding, or a lot of different things. So I would say that never lose passion and always look for what you want. Stay where you are and just continue, because this sector is growing so fast. You don't really have to start from the beginning. You can continue and just pivot. That's all I can actually advise. And they can reach out to me for sure on Twitter or on our email or our website. So.
Got it. Thank you for that, Azam. And for the rest of the three of you, again, just the final few minutes here. Each of you are in companies where you're regularly hiring people. Christian, what are you looking for? What breadth of experience or training?
We're looking in all different sectors. I saw the question in the group chat about someone with an AI background. We're hiring in that area. In other areas, for young people like that are still perhaps still in school or finishing their education, we hire about 20 students each year as interns, from 4 to 12-month internships. And then many of those stay on, and we give them full-time jobs once they graduate. So, and I think we're not atypical in the Canadian space companies. People are looking for good people now. The space sector is booming in Canada, and there are a lot of opportunities. So if you have an interest in, as Am said, not just for engineers. If you're a lawyer that's interested in space, or economist, a business person, life scientist, we just recently hired a life scientist. A lot of opportunities in space. So yeah, don't give up. The opportunities are there.
Got it. I'm getting the message. I could take an extra couple of minutes. I won't go too much beyond that. But Stefan, same question to you. What are you looking for? How would you advise people wanting to be a part of the sector?
Well, so again, it's a broad cross-section of skills that we need, but I'd echo what Azam said. I'm looking for passion. I'm looking for people who really want to be in the space sector, who want to be, and in my case, people who really want to make an impact on climate change, people who really want to participate in a team of people who are all dedicated to reducing greenhouse gas emissions worldwide.
Got it. Steve, I have two questions for you. One, I'll ask about your take on the skill sets that you're looking for, but also we have a question about how many launches you see yourself being able to deliver. This is with the Cyclone 4M vehicle, but I think more broadly, without going into the specifics of the rocket, how many launches ultimately you're hoping to achieve per year?
So we're tempoed to launch 12. It's a medium class launcher, so we can carry 30 satellites at a time. And I think that's an important distinction over other places that have smaller launchers at 150, 200, 300 kilograms. So, OneWeb needs to launch 20 or 30 at a time. Telesat needs to launch a number at a time to get their constellations in orbit. And I think that's a key differentiator for us that allows us to lower that launch tempo and not say, we're going to launch 100 times a year. Keep it at a dozen if we can, and within our current capabilities. And if the market demands more, we'll certainly achieve it. From my perspective, working with the universities across the country already and working with the Canadian Space Agency, the passion is certainly there. There's students that are launching suborbital rockets and building them themselves, building test facilities. CSA has been funding a program for each a number of universities in each province to build CubeSats that have been launched from the ISS, that there's another phase of that coming out. And I'm seeing that energy around me, and it really is that passion, it is that enthusiasm. This is for me, space launch for Canada is a big deal. But underneath that is all this students and general public and enthusiasm that I'm getting on a day in and day out basis, cheering for this thing to happen. We did an economic impact study. We looked at how people saw this project going forward, and the local people were all about jobs. But the other part, we looked regionally in Atlantic Canada and how they perceived this project, and it was all about go Canada. It's now, it's our time. Let's make this thing happen. It's grab this while you can. And this won't last, right? This space economy will pass us by. The UK is trying to do something. Australia is trying to do something. New Zealand, different places around the globe and stuff. We've got a head start because of the strong backbone we have with our space economy already, with our space agency that has been around since the late 60s, really to move this thing forward and grab this opportunity, complete the picture of not just satellites, but launch and services out the back end of this thing. And it's really that opportunity is there for everyone. And these kids love it. They're coming out of the woodwork day in and day out. They don't want to leave Canada. They want to stay here and be a part of this. And it is that enthusiasm, echoing what everybody else said, that we're really keen to see.
Excellent. Thank you for that final note. And going back to the picture behind me, grab it while you can. It may not be there forever, so Canada has to move. We'll have to leave it there, but hopefully this has stimulated thoughts and maybe further conversations for all of you and for our audience. On behalf of the Globe and Mail, I just want to thank again Azam, Steve, Christian, and Stefan for joining us today and for all of their thoughts and perspectives. I'd also like to thank everyone in the audience who sent questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but I know in some of the topics that we hit, we got to multiple questions at the same time. And of course, I would like once again to thank Maritime Launch Services for sponsoring today's event. We will be sharing a link to the recorded version of the webcast in about 1 week's time. And with that, I'll say thank you very much. And to all of you, enjoy the rest of your day.